Everybody knows how tough Georgia's schedule is in 2024. It's been one of the biggest offseason topics for Georgia football over these last few months is, hey, they're going to have to play Texas, Bama, Ole Miss, Clemson, Kentucky, all these really, really good football teams, and just an SEC schedule in general. The week in, week out grind of that is always pretty tough, and Georgia's has been tough over the last couple of years. It's tough this year, but at home, not as tough, right? When you think about all those teams that I named on that list, those games are not going to be played in Sanford Stadium. 4 of those will be on the road, and 1 will be down the road at a neutral site in Atlanta against Clemson for that Chick-fil-A kickoff football game, a game that Georgia's familiar with. They played it in a couple of times over in Kirby Smart's tenure, and this will be the second time in 3 years, and it'll be the second time in 4 years that I'm getting my math wrong. The second time in 2 years, and then the second time in 3 years to play Clemson. Right? You just watch me work through that. Florida is also a neutral site. That is every year. So the home schedule is Mississippi State, Auburn, Tennessee Tech, UMass, and Georgia Tech, and Tennessee. So 6 home games, not super tough, right? You got a couple cupcakes in there between UMass and Tennessee Tech, and then you got Georgia Tech, rival, on the uprise. We'll talk about that a little bit. It really comes down to, okay, well, what's going to be the toughest between Auburn, Mississippi State, and Tennessee? And I think it's going to be that Tennessee game. Is Georgia going to run into trouble? Maybe I should have started with that question. Is Georgia going to run into trouble at the end of the year when they're dealing with a tough schedule that's accumulated? Maybe some injuries are added up, and you see that at November after the grind of going on the road and dealing with that. I think it's Tennessee is probably your answer for what is going to be Georgia's toughest home game at Sanford Stadium in 2024. Not Georgia's toughest game, but the toughest game at home. A place that they've been extremely, extremely successful at while Kirby Smart is the head coach, and just have been in general over the course of history, but extremely successful over Kirby Smart's tenure for sure at that spot in Sanford. Well, let's talk about Auburn a little bit. You know, I read somewhere where they were talking about how Auburn is going to be a really tough matchup for Georgia this year. They play them tough every year. That's not necessarily the case, right? Yes, that game was dramatic. It's 27-20. Auburn has a lead over Georgia in the first half of that game a year ago, and it was like, hey, is this Georgia team not as good as we thought? They didn't blow out all these cupcake teams as badly as we thought they might at the beginning of the season, and then that rolls over to, well, the first SEC game of the year. They struggle, they played South Carolina that year as well, but which was also a struggle fest. And then they struggle on the road against Auburn. Jordan Hare Stadium is an incredible environment. It's one of the toughest environments that I've been to, doing this job. I think that Georgia pulled out a tough one against a rival. Well, think about 2 years ago. It was like 42-7, and Georgia ran all over Auburn. Auburn brings back a lot. You look at this roster, and they bring back Peyton Thorne. They bring back Jarquez Hunter. They get Cam Coleman. There's a lot of excitement on that offense. They bring back a lot of their defense as well. You get another year of Hughes Freeze. Will Auburn maybe take a little bit of a step forward? I think it's a tough SEC, and I think that there's going to be some games that I just don't think they're going to win. This is one of them, unfortunately, for the Auburn Tigers at what is most likely going to be the number 1 Georgia Bulldogs in October, right? At this point, I think Georgia's undefeated going at Kentucky, at Alabama. I know that's tough to deal with the prior weeks, dealing with that Clemson game, but I think that Georgia's second home game against Auburn is not its toughest. And then you follow that up with a game against Mississippi State. I'm going to be completely frank with you. I don't know a ton about this Mississippi State team as much. I know that they performed even worse than I thought they would a year ago. I think that there's less stability there than there is at the other SEC programs that Georgia is going to face at home. It's not a rivalry game. I know that there's been Georgia teams that have been much better that should have beaten Mississippi State more than they should have, by more than they actually did. Think about that 2020 game where they had JT Daniels out there throwing for 400 touchdowns. I just don't think this is Georgia's toughest game at home, and I don't think I think it's probably the third or the fourth, to be quite frank with you. Tennessee, that game in November, the beginning of a 3-game home stretch to end the season for Georgia. So the beginning of that, following up a 2-week run where you play Florida and then at Ole Miss. So 2 road games for Georgia, a bye in between that Florida game and that Texas game that Georgia's going to have to deal with before they play Tennessee. So they've dealt with some emotional matchups. I think that at Ole Miss is going to be tough just because there are good stakes for Ole Miss this year. They could make the SEC championship for sure because I think that their schedule is favorable. I think they're going to have a pretty good offense. I think that they could be a little better on defense, and it's going to be at Ole Miss. Now, Georgia beat the living crap out of them a year ago, and I do think that Georgia's going to go over to Oxford and win that game. I think that Georgia's totally has a good chance to go undefeated this season. I do think that the Tennessee game in November is a tough one. There's a lot of buzz around Nico Iamaleava. Ah, man, I had it earlier. I practiced his name earlier before this video. Nico Iamaleava. I think it's Iamaleava. That's what I'm saying for now. Nico Iamaleava. Well, regardless of his name, there's a lot of buzz around the kid being really good. Former 5-star. This is year 2 for him. Sat behind Joe Milton last year. I've had a pretty good read on the Tennessee situation over the last couple of years. I knew what they were in 2022 when they had Hendon Hooker, when they beat an Alabama team that, hey, it was a fun win. It wasn't as impressive as it maybe looked, in my opinion. Then there was, hey, man, Joe Milton, and Georgia takes care of Hendon Hooker, and it's fine. They destroyed that Tennessee team. It was a run and gun team that was either side to side on offense or right over the top. There was really not that much in between in their offensive game. They've had some good running backs. We double checked to see. They're losing one of their running backs this year. They do still have a couple of wide receivers from the last couple of years: Brew McCoy, Squirrel White, Chaz Nimrod. They've got some continuity there, Chris Brazzell. So I'm giving Tennessee's flowers. I think this is going to be a solid football team. You move into 2023, right? I kind of got sidetracked there. You know that Joe Milton is a downgrade from Hendon Hooker as a quarterback. Obviously, the arm talent is there with Hendon Hooker, or with Joe Milton, but it just wasn't going to be enough to beat this Georgia defense. Georgia beat the crap out of Tennessee last year. I don't think Tennessee's gotten that much better. I do think that this is an improvement at quarterback, especially with what I've read about Nico and the clips that I've seen. I think that this is going to be one of the better quarterbacks in the country. There's a reason, I think that maybe this is a little bit too much hype to jump at the jump, but it could end up being justified. He's now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He's got the 6th best Heisman odds behind Jalen Milroe, ahead of Jackson Dart for Heisman odds. So I think this is going to be a solid offense if he can break out as an SEC breakout, a college football breakout this year. It's a defense that has some names. You think about James Pierce Jr. This is a guy that's being mocked up there with Micah Williams to be one of the first defensive players off the board in the 2025 draft. I literally just saw a 2025 mock draft a couple of hours ago that had James Pierce going in the top 3 behind Carson Beck, right? Another guy that is getting mocked up there. So this is a solid football team. You're 3 or 4 for Josh Heupel. Things are, or maybe 5. I think it's 4. Things are moving forward. They took a step back last year. At the end of the day, their personnel just wasn't as good. They didn't have as good of a quarterback. Their weapons weren't as top end as they were the year prior, so the offense dipped. Georgia went in there and just did whatever they wanted on that defense. I expect that that's going to be able to help them at home, them knowing that they can score on a defense like Tennessee's. I just think that that's a positive for them. And I also think that this Georgia team is really good. And I think that the gap is going to be similar to what it was last year between these two teams. And then you add the fact that it's at home. Tennessee is not without its challenges. This is the one schedule that I didn't have at the ready pulled up, and I'll get it for you. Tennessee leading into this Georgia game gets a home stretch of Alabama, Kentucky, Florida, and Mississippi State. So they're going to be experiencing a lot at home. It's going to be a road test against definitely in my eyes, and probably in everybody's eyes, the best team in college football and the best team they've had to face all year. So I'm not predicting that Tennessee's going to win this game, but I do think that it's going to be Georgia's toughest home matchup. Maybe they give them a little bit of trouble. Double-digit win. It's far away. Thanks for watching.